Now is the time for the affirmative conclusion. Turretinfan, you have 10 minutes. You may begin when you're ready.
Thanks. In today's debate, we've seen that what the scriptures clearly teach is that there isn't supposed to be any bowing down to images. And the scriptural testimony on that's pretty clear. Now, Mr. Albrecht's argument is that that's just referring to idolatry. Our point is, yes, exactly, it's referring to idolatry, except he wants to limit idolatry to in some way beyond simply bowing down to images. It's got to have some additional elements he didn't prove, and elements he couldn't establish that the fathers held to either. Instead, he simply refers to the fact that some of the fathers talk about having images but not worshiping them, which I made the same distinction and said we're not debating the issue of having images in general. The issue is veneration, which is a species of worship. It's an aspect of religious veneration, not just any kind of, keeping something clean or, taking care of it or just any kind of service in general, but a religious veneration. People can tell the difference between seeing a picture that's in a Roman Catholic church with people lighting candles in front of it and so forth, and a picture that's just in a library looking down on people who happen to be reading. People understand the difference between someone who just takes care of those pictures and someone who venerates a religious image. It's easy to kind of gloss over that distinction, but it's an important one. I mean, he cites to some remarkable sources during this discussion. For example, he cites to the Ludwig Ott, who talks about the use of images coming in from the image veneration growing from the 5th to 7th centuries, which, kind of supports exactly what I said. And you can go back and listen to what the quotation he gave was. But again, he talks about the Jews, talking about when images start to become popular. Some Jewish group made an exception. The exception was you can carve these pillars or columns, and those, but you can't worship them. But he says, well, but you could have bowed down to them. And how in the world is someone supposed to distinguish between bowing down to those pillars and worshiping them? Do you really think that someone in one of these synagogues bowing down to the column is going to say, "Oh no, I wasn't giving latria to the column. I was only giving dulia to the column, or toward the column, or toward God through the column"? Of course not. The point is, don't bow down to them. They're there for decoration. They're there to make it interesting. And the whole question of whether or not decorations would be sinful isn't really the issue. It may well be that it's okay to have images of some kind in the church, and that it's not imprudent because it doesn't lead to the kind of thing that we see in the Roman Catholic Church today, where we have veneration of them. And plenty of people in Protestant churches don't have a problem with having pictures. They have a problem, because the scripture teaches clearly against it, of venerating them. And of course the discussion here wasn't really focused on what the scripture teaches. The focus was here on, well, what did the early church do? Man, the early church fell into many kinds of errors. The fact that they fell into idolatry, and according to the testimony of Eusebius, which is the ancient source that we have to talk about this, and it's from the Ecclesiastical History, which is not some kind of disputed work of his. It's an authentic work. That the source is the Gentiles. It came in from the heathen. Of course, that's why Eusebius gets cited a lot by the iconoclastic church members, which Mr. Albrecht doesn't really talk about much. He kind of glosses over that and talks about it being widespread and so forth, although there's this huge council 30 years before the Second Ecumenical Council. Oh yes, and talking about that second Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, i.e. the 7th Ecumenical Council in the usual series of these councils, that council doesn't make the distinction between veneration and adoration. It doesn't have this latria dulia distinction built in. In fact, it's the way that it uses the terms, it uses them interchangeably, and it calls an anathema down on people who try to say that it's okay to have them for decoration but not for adoration, veneration. And, you can't, Trent does adopt, it doesn't come out and repeat the exact words, but it does adopt what the Second Council of Nicaea said. So that is, of course, authoritative church doctrine. The Catechism of the Council of Trent was propounded under the authority. Of course, it's not the dogmatic decrees or definitions of the council, but good luck finding Roman Catholic sources that have authority counting the second commandment as the second commandment. Instead, they just make it an appendix to the first commandment. That's all that the source that Mr. Albrecht identified from my website was saying, which of course wasn't really directly on this topic anyway. But the issue of the Old Testament examples of the cherubim in the on top of the Ark of the Covenant or the brass serpent, again, there's no encouragement of religious veneration of those objects. And in fact, the brass serpent ends up getting some religious veneration, then it's destroyed. That's the history of what happened in Israel. And the cherubim were hidden. They were always placed on the Ark of the Covenant, which no one was allowed to see except the high priest once a year. And when he was there, he was looking between the cherubim at the empty space to communicate with God, not looking at the cherubim. The fact that he's kneeling down or prostrating himself near the cherubim is absolutely as irrelevant as the fact that someone, when they go to church and they kneel down in church, is kneeling next to their fellow sinners. No one's suggesting that we should be paying religious veneration, I hope, to sinful people or even to heretics who happen to be in the church and happen to be next to the person, or to the devil who might be standing by watching what's going on, but you're kneeling near him, so you're paying veneration? Of course not. No, that's this argument from the fact that the churches, some few churches, had these images is not an argument that has any weight. Now, there's an obvious reason why there are not a lot of early second or third century examples like Dur Europos. There was a lot of persecution then. If you had a building that was identifiably a religious building, you'd have problem with the easy location of that building as, oh, this must be a church. We'll hang out here. When the Christians come back, we'll persecute them. So there's a reason why Christians didn't necessarily mark out their places of worship, which were oftentimes homes, as being specifically places of worship, using decorations like icons and images painted on the wall in mural fashion where it's hard to remove it. There's sort of those practical reasons why you don't have that, even if you buy into the idea that Dur Europos was typical of that time period. Well, at least you understand now why it wasn't typical during the times of intense persecution to have those kind of buildings with those kinds of decorations. It is something that came in later, and it is something that developed. It's not something that was static. It's unreasonable to imagine that there was a Our Lady of Guadalupe shrine near as a side altar in a church in the 1st century or the 2nd century. Of course, that I'm being intentionally anachronistic there, but the point is there wasn't anything like that. And even Dur Europos doesn't have any shrines or anything like that. It has decorations. Who knows what they were for? We don't know what sect it was. We didn't hear any evidence about what sect of Christians was there. Of course, the condition of the site precludes that kind of finding. There wasn't text on the wall telling us what kind it is, and a vague comparison between the appearance of the images or the pictures and other pictures is quite a strain. If we consider the question of what Basil actually said, well, we'd really like to know what work that was. Based on the tracking it down in Schaff cites it to Epistle 205 of Basil, which in the typical collections that are online for Basil is the wrong letter. It's not the correct letter, so there's more than one numbering. I did find it in a copy of the works, but there is a question mark next to that particular letter in the copy I found. I'd want to spend more time investigating this, but it doesn't really matter. The only question is whether or not Basil talks about religiously venerating this icon, and he points out that in his basically limited discussion, extremely limited from what we're quoted, that he sometimes kisses them in a reverential way. Well, I mean, maybe that's some example of religious veneration, but it's nothing like the extent or the kind of religious veneration that we see in, for example, Roman Catholicism today. And Roman Catholicism isn't alone in that. There's lots of other churches who do it. Doesn't make any more right or wrong whether or not other people join in. But what we should focus on is what the scriptures teach. And when it comes to the issue of veneration of images of any kind, in scriptures, it's always one way. There's never any positive example of doing it, and it's universally condemned from the examples I gave in the Pentateuch until John's exhortation, little children, keep yourselves from idols. And yes, the religious veneration of such images is idolatry. So please, dear listener, do keep yourselves from idols.
Okay, and that ends the debate. Thank you, Turretinfan and Mr. Albrecht, for participating.